tym dość wyjątkowym wydaniu programu dziś wieczorem naszym gościem jest kongresmen Peter Roskam, republikanin, jeden z 4 najbardziej wpływowych republikańskich kongresmenów, mający ogromny wpływ na politykę zagraniczną kształtowaną na waszyngtońskim Kapitolu. Sir, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
When you look on the map of the world from Polish perspective, the most problematic place, if I may call it like that, is Eastern Ukraine and Russia. And when you look on the map of the world from Washington perspective, how does it look like? The biggest problem is Russia, Ukraine, or maybe Iran, North Korea, Northern Africa. How does it look like?
Well, you're closer to it than I am in Warsaw than I am in Washington or where my home is in Chicago. But I was in Ukraine and Georgia last month leading a delegation of American members of Congress. And nobody has to convince me the nature of the Russian threat, the aggressiveness, and how important it is for the West to stand up to the aggression of Putin. So it's all a matter of perspective. I accept that at face value, but I view us as all in this together.
But for us, definitely, the biggest threat is the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, or maybe towards Europe, but let's hope so, it's only theoretical. But from American perspective, what takes the most of the time of American diplomats to handle? Iran, Northern Africa, or Russia, if you can judge it?
Well, if I were going to have to judge it, I would say Iran right now because of the nature of this agreement that President Obama wants the U.S. to get involved in. I think it's a terrible agreement, and I'm doing everything I can to stop it in the United States. Now, that said, I mean, to your point, implicitly, that's not the only threat. There's voices of authoritarianism that are around the world, and these voices have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with clarity and with solidarity and unity. And the idea of sort of splitting the West up and saying this is our priority and that's not a priority is a foolish game. And I think we've got to recognize the Iranian threat is significant, the Russian threat is significant, the rise of ISIS is significant, and we don't have the luxury of saying these are mutually exclusive. In many cases, they're deeply interconnected.
Can you convince people, for example, in Poland, that the agreement with Iran is a mistake? Because a lot of people would say the oil prices would go down. It looks good. So why it is a problem?
It's a mistake, in my opinion, because it's unverifiable. So remember, President Reagan, who is so highly regarded here in Poland, said what about the Soviet Union? He said, trust and verify. This is not trust and verify. This is trust and hope that the Iranians are going to do what they say that they're going to do. There is no opportunity to do a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365-day inspection. It gives the Iranians $150 billion in an infusion of cash into their economy, and even the proponents of this deal will tell you that it is their expectation, actually, that the Iranians are going to use some of this money, and that's probably billions of dollars, for illicit activities and terrorism around the world. And the other thing is, it gives the Iranians the imprimatur of approval of a nuclear ambition that is peaceful. That's ridiculous. It is not a peaceful nuclear ambition. They're using it to try and drive their agenda around the world, and we need to stop them.
Israeli Prime Minister said that thanks to this agreement, we are creating the richest terrorist state on earth, Iran. Do you share this opinion?
I think that's right. I think that's one of the subcategories of it. In other words, this huge cash infusion that they get. Look, they got $10 billion in sanctions relief simply for sitting down during the negotiations. How ridiculous is that? They gave up absolutely nothing, and they got $10 billion in sanctions relief. And then I think they had the Obama administration on a roll, and they've come up with this agreement, and there's a lot of opposition to it in the United States Congress. I predict that we will be able to have a majority of members of the House and the Senate vote against it. President Obama will surely veto it, and the question is, can we override his veto? And that's an open question right now.
In the U.S. Congress, you are also an expert on energy and how much the U.S. policy has changed thanks to shale gas and thanks to such a huge oil production in the U.S. right now.
Oh, it's just incredible. I mean, the United States is on the verge of an energy renaissance, just an absolute renaissance that would create so much opportunity and buoyancy. And think about that energy if it were made available to our friends in Europe that would decouple the relationship that it is a stronghold that Vladimir Putin has over a number of European countries. And the ability to pursue that and make that available on the world market would make us less dependent, obviously, on these nations, these authoritarian nations in the Middle East, and more available to make it for our friends.
Exactly, because for decades we thought that the US is a superpower, but to some extent dependent on oil production in the Arab states and in relations with the Arab states. It's not the case anymore.
It's not. It doesn't have to be the case anymore. Sometimes America's policies limits America's potential, and that's what the United States is trying to sort out right now. And look, there's a lot of ambiguity about in the United States today about what is the role of the United States around the world. There's some voices that say that the United States is not a force for good. There's others that say that the U.S., the sun has gone down on it in terms of influence. I reject both of those. I think that the United States has an incredibly important role to play, but we've got to do it from a position of strength, economic strength, military strength, and strength in pursuing our own natural resources.
Let's get back for a moment to Russia, because many times President Obama declared that Russia is not the enemy number one for the U.S. And we are not on the verge of the next Cold War. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's regrettable that during the debate between Mitt Romney and President Obama in 2012, Mitt Romney talked about Russia as being a key opponent of the United States, and President Obama mocked him. He made fun of him. And I think if he could reclaim that, President Obama may not want to have made that mocking, condescending statement. Because look, the nature of Vladimir Putin and his designs are aggressive, they're strategic, he knows what he's doing, he's taking incremental steps along the way, and he's probing and he's testing the resolve of the West. I was in Ukraine last month, as I mentioned, and had an opportunity to meet with President Poroshenko and a number of the other Ukrainian leaders, and while there, it became very, very clear to me that Ukraine has turned a new leaf. They're dealing with a number of the corruption issues internally, and there's a great opportunity, but they need to be supported, not just from a financial point of view. They need the financial support. Natalie Jaresko, the chairman of the finance ministry, needs that support, but also they need more military support. And I think it is regrettable that the United States is not providing that.
We have an ongoing debate in Poland about U.S. military presence in our country, and I think my countrymen would feel much more happy and, first of all, much more secure with much higher visibility of U.S. military presence in our country. Do you think that the U.S. is ready for it, to step in this part of Europe?
Well, we're in the midst of a presidential campaign. It's a year-long venture, as you know, and part of the discussion is just this exact projection of power vis-a-vis Russia. So I am of the opinion that we would be much better off to project strength, and particularly here in Poland and the Baltic states that are saying, look, we want more of a NATO presence here. It has a restraining influence. There's a counter argument that says, well, you're going to provoke Vladimir Putin. And my suggestion is, yeah, it's like, look, that's ridiculous. He's provoked already. So this idea that we're going to extra provoke him, forget about it. He's provoked already, so let's meet the provocation with clarity. Ambiguity is a disaster when it comes to foreign policy. Clarity and naming things and being strong and together, I think, makes all the difference in the world.
Who will be the next president of the U.S.? I can assume that you are going to say a Republican, but which one?
Well, I hope it's a Republican. I'm a Republican. But look, it's supposed to be a very difficult enterprise in the United States to become the nominee of a major party. And it is. It is a lot of work. So you've got to go through this incredible proving ground. It's not unlike a big election in Poland. It's a big, big election. And so toward that end, we've got, what, 15 or 16 candidates now? I can't even keep track of them all who are running for president. But it will thin down. And before long, we'll have 2 or 3 major contenders for the Republican nomination. There's a number of Democrats that are thinking about challenging Hillary Clinton. It's not for sure that she's necessarily the nominee of her party, although she's in the strongest position. And then, you know, American politics, it's a lot like Polish politics. You take it very, very seriously, and it's aggressive. And the United States has a fundamental question to ask, and that is, how do we grow our economy? How do we get our spending under control? And how ultimately are we a force for good around the world? And how do we partner with our friends who share those values that are so dear to us? And how do we do that in the most forthright and clear way? And that's the big subject, I think, of this debate this year.
The motto of the campaign of Donald Trump is to make America great again, which would mean that it's not great now. And it's shocking to me, this lack of self-confidence among Americans. Is it true, do you think, that it's a common opinion in the West, that the country is not as great as it could be?
I think it's always, are we living up to our potential? And are we dealing with the nature of the threats that are out there? I am someone who clearly believes that the best days of the United States are always ahead. I spend a lot of time with young children and with students, interacting with them, and I come away from these discussions very upbeat and very optimistic about, you know, the direction of the country and what our potential is. I think about things that the United States has been through historically in my parents' lifetime, in my grandparents' lifetime, difficulties that a complicated country has managed to overcome and persevere. So I have every confidence that the United States will emerge and will lead and be the type of nation that is a willing partner and a valid partner for freedom-loving people all over the world. It's challenging, and the nature of the challenge has gotten more and more complex with these rising voices of authoritarianism, but I'm convinced that we'll be able to do it.
So one last question about the campaign, because a lot of people in Europe will think that it's quite easy to answer the question, who's going to win the elections? The guy with the biggest budgets. Does it work like that, or it's more complex?
Not necessarily. It doesn't work like that. It's more complex. So if you're running for president right now in the United States, you've got to figure out how you deal with the individual voter activists in 3 early states, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Iowa. You've got to figure out how you're going to handle your opponents, because you need to win, but you want them alongside you a year from now to campaign for you with your party. You've got to figure out how to handle the media, all the interviews and all the interactions. Then you've got to figure out how do you handle some of the wealthy people who have an interest, but they don't want to be perceived as buying an election. You've got all of these different factors to try and navigate. And the one that can do it, that can bring it all together, will end up, you know, running. And then you've got a general election, which is huge. And think about it. If you can't handle that process, then you can't handle a general election. If you can't handle the general election, you can't handle Vladimir Putin. You can't handle the mullahs. You can't handle ISIS. So this is a great proving ground, and it's something that Americans have come to expect. And we, I think, like Poles, have very high expectations of the people that are called to lead our country.
I already said one last question, but I have one more. Because during last presidential elections in Poland, the internet played maybe not the key role, but it was an important factor for the results of the elections. If you can compare it to the US, what's the most important part of the game during the elections? Is it still the old media like television and the radio, the internet, social media, or personal contact, going from one door to the other and talking to the voters?
It depends on where you are. So if you're living in New Hampshire, if you're a voter up in New Hampshire, it's a tiny little state in the New England and the northeast part of the United States, you have an expectation that you get to meet individual members who are running for president 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and to shake their hand and visit with them. The further you are away from those early states, the more distant it becomes. So early on, there's a lot of personal contact. Later on, it's more mass media and general media, and even, as you pointed out, the new media. So it's a combination of all of those things.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure talking to you. Naszym gościem wyjątkowo dziś wieczorem był kongresmen Peter Roskam, jeden z najbardziej wpływowych republikańskich kongresmenów na Kapitolu.